seen nationwide, but with a focus on voting in New Hampshire and the bills that have been worked on in the past and what's coming up in the next session. So I just wanted to take a minute to talk about voting as the bedrock of all of our rights, of all of our civil rights, and especially on today, this anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I think it's really important to talk about and to ground our right to vote in its, frankly, pretty shameful history in the United States. Too many people have struggled, suffered, and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote. That's, of course, the amazing Representative John Lewis. But I wanted him to be able to kick us off so that we can remember that these issues have a long history, and we have a lot of work to do on it. And in particular, it's because of the United States' really shameful history of voter suppression that New Hampshire is not immune from. The Voting Rights Act, it sought to end the voter suppression and to end the systemic racism that has happened in our history, as, very often voting laws have been used by those in power to stay in power. Which also means to disenfranchise those who don't agree with them. And historically, those in power have historically been white men, and those who have been systematically excluded from the voting process are underrepresented minorities, and especially Black people. And so, of course, these restrictive voting laws that we have seen over the years are all stem from a lot of the historical racist laws that we've had in our past and that still exist here, although they have adapted in their form. Back in the time when it was literacy tests and poll taxes and strict restrictions on the right to vote, many of those were struck down. The Voting Rights Act has served to, make those laws unconstitutional. However, we've seen that efforts at voter suppression have gotten more creative. When we see things like voter ID laws and ideas around fraud, those actually came as a result of not of widespread fraud, but of more and more, frankly, Black people voting. That's where we saw our first voter ID laws, because largely the people who did not have access to an ID and to these types of proof were lower income people and were Black people. So just as we're thinking about what's happening now with some distrust, some information, and with some sort of suppressive voting laws, we really have to remember that these are just sort of the newest effort in a long line of attempts to suppress the vote of those who don't necessarily agree with those in power. And so I know Representative Lane is going to speak to a number of the ways that this has been manifesting in New Hampshire, both in the past and in today.
Thanks, Kelsey. So keeping students from voting, that is and around SB3, which is in court right now, and a lower court judge has said that it is unconstitutional. You need, in order to read the affidavit to register on the same day, you need a reading level of equivalent to 2 PhDs. And needless to say, that is very confusing, and it definitely scares some people because it outlines penalties, and it is set up to scare people from registering. And that has been ongoing, I would think, probably 20 years on and off, about trying to fight to keep students from voting. And people of lower income also, because oftentimes English is their second language, and they may not have the same reading level, even though they are a citizen, they may not have the same reading level in English, even though they are a citizen. And it's definitely been a targeted goal of the Republicans to keep them from voting. Every time that we have tried to make registration or absentee, you can go to the next slide if you want. Kelsey, can I? Every time that we've tried to make registration easier or make absentee voting easier, it has either been voted down in previous sessions, but in both 2019 and 2020, We had bills in to make both of those much easier. They passed, and the governor has vetoed them, some of them twice. So in 2019 and 2020. So the other way that in New Hampshire that we have seen voter suppression is gerrymandering. Incredulously, the Republicans deny that there's been gerrymandering, and if there's been gerrymandering, then how come we had House the Democrats a majority in the House and in the Senate? And what they refuse to understand, that it took a super majority, or the blue tsunami, for us to do that, and that if it had been equally fairly districted, we wouldn't have had to have that blue tsunami. Court challenges in every recent decade, they've had to go back and correct it, and it has been a long, drawn-out process, and it is designed to keep Republican control of both the House and the Senate. And I think those of you who live in Concord or in Indy, the Executive Council, you'd look at a map of what the Executive Council looks like for Andy Walensky, and it literally goes across the state, and they call it the Dragon District. So, and that basically it was to concede that the Democrats would get one seat on the council. And so they put all the, quote, liberal cities into one district. The other thing is campaign funding. We have tried again and again to put transparency in campaign funding. All of the bills we passed were vetoed, and or tabled. So the one that there was one to limit disclosures to, contributions to 2,500 before you, but it's now 5,000, and that got put aside. There's also a loophole in the statutes and the way it's done, that you can have multiple LLCs that don't identify who the people are. So I could set up an LLC and, Connie Lane LLC, and give $5,000 to Andy, and then I could do another LLC and give another $5,000. So I can get around the $5,000 cap. And a lot of people do that, particularly at the gubernatorial level. So I think that's it for my piece of that. So the bills in New Hampshire, I think I already mentioned them, that we've done. So we would not be in this mess right now with the COVID voting if the bills that we had all passed in the House the past 2 years had been in there. We put in online voter registration. We had put in no excuse absentee balloting. We had a campaign finance reform, and we had redistricting commissions, both as a bill and as a constitutional amendment. And they were all vetoed. If we had had no excuse absentee balloting passed last year, we would have had it all set up and not be scrambling the way we are now. We would have online registration, which would make it much easier for everybody to get registered. Our system is designed, was designed a long time ago, and it expects that you can get to the town hall very easily, and you can get there, and it's going to be an easy process. And that's not what, it's not designed for today's society. And both the Secretary of State and the Republicans resist any change whatsoever to the existing system. And I think that's it.
So speaking of 2020, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what elections have been looking like around the country during this pandemic, and then talk about what it looks like in New Hampshire and what we can all be doing to make sure that our local elections officials are supported and that our voters are supported in making sure that their voices are heard this year. So this photo, I'm sure many of you may recognize it. It is was taken in Milwaukee during their primary, which was the first statewide election since COVID-19 became the new reality in the United States. And we saw in Milwaukee, well, actually we saw across Wisconsin, that voters were not able to get their absentee ballots in and accepted as quickly and as efficiently as they wanted to. Actually, the parties in, well, the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, as well as a lot of progressive voting rights groups, did an amazing job of getting absentee ballots to their electorate and in reaching voters across Wisconsin to talk to them about how we need to shift our elections. And I talk about Wisconsin in particular because Wisconsin looks probably the most like New Hampshire as far as the method of the elections and its relationship with absentee voting. So in Wisconsin, historically in a presidential year, they would have about 8% of their populace voting by absentee ballot, and it's an excuse-only system. And so this year, during their statewide primary, which had a high turnout because there was a Supreme Court justice on the race on the ballot, as I'm sure many of you know. So they were really successful at getting the electorate to say, okay, great, let's request our absentee ballots. However, polling places across Wisconsin were slammed. They were short poll workers, people were quitting, everyone was afraid. And so as a result, they shut down polling places across Wisconsin. In Milwaukee, where this photo is from, they had shut down what was 200 polling places. They closed down 195 of them. So there were 5 out of 200 polling places. So we saw lines around the block there and hours and hours and hours long lines that people were sitting in. This also disproportionately impacted voters of color. The places that we have seen around the country where we have had voters who are disenfranchised by having to wait in incredibly long lines or have their ballot applications not processed are statistically the higher density areas and those areas that are much, much higher minority, young voter and new American voters. And so when we're talking about the inequalities that have existed in our systems nationwide, it's both the voter suppression that we'd referenced before, but as well as our resources are aligned to be more helpful of rural communities where you'll have clerk's offices that have, lower volume and more access to meet one-on-one with their voters, where it's all safer. And so the places where we see these issues around the country are, as I mentioned, the higher volume areas. Which have really served to amplify the barriers and the inequalities that we have seen both by design and by sort of the broader structural inequalities. And we talked about Wisconsin, but Georgia is also instructive because Georgia was an election that saw this coming. The Secretary of State's office, somewhat similarly to New Hampshire's, had ruled that you can vote absentee because of COVID-19, and they actually sent out absentee ballot applications to every voter, the applications, not the ballots. And so voters had access to the applications themselves. However, in Georgia, that's where the Secretary of State's assistance stopped. We saw municipalities who were very confused, who were under-resourced, and who did not have the support that they needed in order to run their elections. And so we saw local elections officials who were not able to keep up with and process absentee ballot applications. And they ended up actually shipping out those applications to a statewide center, which then caused delays and confusion. And so in Georgia, we saw 8-hour-long lines in a number of places, again, disproportionately minority areas. In addition, in South Carolina and Nevada, we saw the same thing. Long lines as a result of voter confusion, polling place understaffing, and generally poll workers. Recruiting poll workers is so important this year. We need to support each of our local elections officials and making sure that we are encouraging everyone who can to be a poll worker this year. In Nevada, I like this story. Despite the fact that lines were 8 hours long in Cook County in Las Vegas, the very last person who got in line to vote and who stayed in line until 3 in the morning. Polls closed at 7 p.m. And the last voter to vote, the one who stood in line for 8 hours, I believe it was 8 hours and 3 minutes, finally voting at 3:03 a.m. was, no joke, an Elvis impersonator. The voter protection director in Las Vegas was out there and personally relayed that story, so we know it's true. So, you know, I don't say this by way of scaring everyone. We can respond to this. And so what do we do to make sure that that does not happen in New Hampshire? How do we support our community? How do we support our voters to make sure that we are equipped? You know, the first and most important thing is to encourage everyone who can to cast their ballots from home. If our voters vote from home, that means that the people who have to vote in person are able to and don't have to wait in line. The people who are going to have to vote in person oftentimes are people who have disabilities and can't use the mail-in voting process, who need assistance, those who have language barriers and who need language assistance, as well as communities that are much more likely to have their ballots thrown out because their name might be hyphenated on their registration and not on their ID. Or, for example, communities who are Black voters who have historically had their ballots disproportionately thrown out. Those communities are much more likely, for good reason, to want to and need to vote in person. And so that means that anybody who can and should vote absentee in order to keep lines down at the polling places. Remember that concern about contracting or spreading COVID-19 is an absolutely valid and appropriate for everyone to vote absentee. And that does not just mean our personal safety. I can and should decide that I'm not going to vote at the polls, because if I'm not voting at the polls, that is one fewer person in line, that is one further person in an enclosed space with our poll workers and with our local elections officials and with the rest of my community. In addition, it's starting and completing the vote from home process as soon as possible. In order to reduce strain on our clerk's offices, we want to get in our requests for the general election now, right? We want to be able to give them 60 days to be able to process those ballots and to get every new ballot request that is coming in, to be able to put those into the computer so that they're not getting a ton at the last moment. As we get closer to the election, as we get to the 30 days out, like we are now in the primary, we want our clerk's offices to be able to focus on getting those ballots out to voters and dealing with those later requests. And so if we can get more people to send them in as soon as possible, we're really helping our local elections officials and making sure that people who are getting their requests in later are still making sure that their ballot is, that their application is put into the system quickly and that their ballot is sent out early, because backlogs hurt voters. In addition, if we're able to do this early, we're going to reduce the strain on the USPS. Some of the confusion caused in previous elections that we're prepared for the most part now, is that mail that used to take 2 days to go across town was taking up to 7 to 10 days in some locations. And so now we know that when a voter has their completed absentee ballot, we don't want to tell them to put it in the mail 5 days before the election. We're going to advise that person to bring it to the post office themselves, to bring it to their clerk's office themselves, to find a safe way to personally deliver their ballot instead of putting it in the mail, to make sure that there aren't any delays that are going to cause that person's ballot to take a little bit longer. So that's sort of broadly how we can encourage our community, but a lot of this is also by demystifying this process. Because only about 10% of Granite Staters have voted absentee in a previous year, and a lot of those folks were voting absentee in person by going to their clerk's office, that means that a lot of people are not comfortable with this process. And you all as candidates and all of us as people who really care about voting and care about New Hampshire's elections should be really comfortable with this process so that we can help all voters to make this clear and as easy as possible. So I'm going to briefly go through the steps just to make sure that we're all on it. And I also find that this helps us to ask questions about the process after we go over the whole thing, because I see in the chat that there are quite a few questions. So the first is to complete the absentee ballot application itself. Now that application is readily available. The application itself is something that can be sent out to anyone. It can be downloaded from the internet. We have it up on our website, voteinnh.org. And this is what the front of the form looks like here. And as our graphic here says, any voter may vote absentee based on COVID, and there's a special box to check saying I'm unable to vote in person due to the concern from the novel coronavirus. They've also updated this form so that with one form, you may request your ballots for both the primary and the general election. So for voters who are looking to get their ballots now, have them also check the ballot for the general election so we can tell our clerks, hey, when you're typing in my info now, please also go ahead and put in my request for the general because that reduces strain on them. So this is the back of the ballot application, and I just want to draw your attention to it really quickly because it can be confusing for voters because there are two different lines with signature. So if I'm a voter and I'm going through the back of this application, I'm going to print my last name, my first name, my domicile address, the address where I'm qualified to vote. A lot of people who are not home, so some people I think are staying with their families or maybe displaced right now, especially due to the novel coronavirus, might want to give a different address of where they know that they will be and they'll be able to get mail. And so you can put in a separate mailing address here. In addition, we're asking all voters to input their phone number and their email address. The reason for this is not so it becomes part of the public record. It does not. It is so that your clerk can get a hold of you if there's an issue. If, for example, you forget to sign your ballot or you've left your street number off of your request, we want our clerks to be able to find you to fix it as quickly as possible, and that's by picking up the phone or shooting an email over to you. So you can see here the signature line under applicant's signature and date signed. This is where every voter should sign if they are able to. So what I mean by that is if you are a voter who is not a disabled voter who needs assistance in filling out the form and is not capable of signing it, you should sign here. All right, so I'm going to put in my signature and the date signed. Down below, this is for if there's another person who is assisting someone with a disability. For example, say I'm visually impaired and I can't read it or sign the form. I'm going to have someone assist me with it. If someone's assisting me, they should sign this, this lower portion. For the vast majority of voters though, they don't need to see that bottom half. All they have to do is sign that first section and they're done. There's a little bit of confusing language in this form that we're really hopeful that the Secretary of State's office will update. We have been, I think, somewhat vocal in asking them to please take it down because the language can be confusing. We are not comparing signatures. Signature comparison was struck down as unconstitutional in 2018 under Saucedo versus Gardner. That remains the case. So this bolded and underlined language in there is not relevant. There is no signature comparison that is taking place this year. Okay, so we filled out our form, right? We did the front, we did the back. The next step is to return your ballot application. So this form, you may get back to your clerk's office in one of four ways. I can drop it off in person. For my request form, I could take it over to my clerk's office. For the request form, I could drop it in a Dropbox. I could mail it, or I can fax or email it. Frankly, as a Gen Xer, I'm more comfortable with email. And so what I did with mine is that I was able to affix my signature the way that I do with my legal pleadings. And I emailed it to my clerk and said, hello, please find attached my absentee ballot application. Please let me know if this is acceptable, if there are any issues with it. And then my wonderful clerk, Kelly Barnaby, was able to respond right away saying, yes, thank you. We are inputting this into the system. It's appropriate. So that is my recommendation to those who can, is to scan in and email your form and do so with a question to your clerk to please confirm it. So we make sure that there aren't any issues up front. Again, it's taking that pressure and the burden off of the clerks as much as we can. In addition, you can fax it. So the next step is to track your absentee ballot request form and your ballot. So what I'm going to show you here is the Secretary of State's tracking portal that's on their website. We had some brilliant people in the legislature a number of years ago who passed a law mandating that the Secretary of State's office provided a way for voters to make sure that their absentee ballot applications and their ballots were received by their clerks and that they were in the system. So this is that portal. It's also linked off of our website, voteinnh.org. So once I get to this portal, I'm going to select my town or city. I currently live in Portsmouth, and I would put in my first name, last name, my date of birth, and then I'm going to type in the characters here. And then I'm going to hit this search button. And then what's going to come up is my information, right? So you can see my voter ID number. You can see my town or city. I'm registered in Portsmouth, where I live. And you can see here that I have submitted my ballot request form for the state primary election. Clerk Barnaby received my ballot, and it was put into the computer on July 7th of 2020. And so I was able to look and see, yes, she got it, great. Then now, if I were to go back to this site, I would be able to see that my ballot was mailed and the date that my ballot was mailed. I took the screenshot before I got my ballot, but now I have. And so if I were to go and look at it, I would see the date that the ballot was mailed to me. So if, for example, I'm checking my mail and I don't have it, I should go to this website and say, hey, have they sent it out to me? Just as a flag, if your ballot application is not showing up in this database after about 5 days, I would recommend giving your clerk and or our hotline a call so that we can make sure we can troubleshoot any issues. We're really trying to make sure that this is smooth, and sometimes, for example, if there's a backlog, it's a flag for us that the clerk may need more support, and it's a reason that we can reach out to our communities and make sure that we're focusing on, getting them the staff that they need through recruitment. So please call our hotline if you're seeing any delays on that. We'll help you troubleshoot it, and it helps us to know where there are issues so that we can provide support to the clerks. I've also flagged here that you can find your clerk's information here. So for some voters who don't know who their clerks are, you can find it on this site. I will note that the Secretary of State's website is not always correct, and so some of their clerk's information is wrong. For example, I believe they were giving out the incorrect clerk's info for North Andover, and so we had a lot of ballots that were returned. But so, look here, but also double check. And let us know if it's wrong. We were able to call the Secretary of State's office and let them know they had incorrect information for North Andover, and I'm very hopeful that they have fixed it. In addition, on the right here, you see the Where Do I Vote symbol. And so if I were to click on that, it'll tell me what ward I am registered in, because the ballot request form asks me to input my ward. All right, now we're on the fun part. This is my ballot. So this is the great part that we all know and love, right? The voting. So on the left here, we'll see our ballots. We're gonna get the same ballots this year that you're having in the polls and at home. And so I'm gonna vote my ballot exactly how I would at the polls, except for I get to do it in the comfort of my home. And then after I voted my ballot, I'm gonna fold it up and put it inside this inner envelope. Right? When you get your ballot, you want to make sure that you have all three of these things. You have your ballot, you have the inner affidavit envelope, and you have the election mail outer envelope. And this inner envelope, you need to make sure that you sign it. On the right side here, we see absence because of religious observance or physical disability. And this does not specifically state COVID-19 concerns on this form. Again, we're in touch with the Secretary of State's office and the AG's office. We are very hopeful that they will fix this, but for now, there is no mention of COVID on this form. We have been assured that you can write in COVID-19 concerns here and sign it. So for my ballot, once I actually turn in my ballot, I keep it so I can use it as a visual on these. But I will write in COVID-19 as the reason I'm voting absentee and signing it. But signing this envelope is incredibly important. The #1 reason why ballots are not accepted is because voters forget to sign this envelope. Again, clerks are going to catch it. They'll be able to call you and reach out if you give them your information if there's an error. But we, again, want to really support our clerks in making sure that voters are getting this right. And so really emphasizing this is so important. Okay. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize all of this. We have resources for you. So on the left, you'll see our Vote from Home 7-step one-pager, which is available to all of you, and we'll make sure it gets sent out as a follow-up email that walks you through this. Easy and helpful to just sort of walk any voter through. You're welcome to dispense it as widely as possible. I believe that when more voters vote, democracy wins, as well as, you know, hopefully the Democratic Party. But really happy to spread this information as widely as possible to make sure all voters are able to access the polls. The other resource that we've had up since April is our website, voteinnh.org. This is a website that frankly I personally manage because I want to make sure that all of the information that is on here is correct. So that if we have a voter who's having a problem, the voter can come here and find the answers. I'm actually in the process of a redesign, so the front page in the next week should hopefully have a more of a step-by-step, because I think this information can sometimes be overwhelming. But all of this information is there. In addition, we have an FAQs page where we keep it constantly updated with the kind of questions that we're hearing coming in from voters who are calling our voter access hotline. So, you know, questions like, what does domicile mean? Who is eligible to vote? I go to college in New Hampshire, but my parents live out of state. Can I vote here? For all of the questions like this, we have most of these answers in the FAQs, and note that it's searchable so you can find things. However, if there's a question that you or a voter have that is not in our FAQs, that's what our voter assistance hotline is here for. So my team is a team of amazing lawyers in New Hampshire who have been doing this work, many of them for years, and others are volunteers who have learned New Hampshire rules and laws. We are not there to give people legal advice. We are there to make sure that voters have accurate and consistent information so they can make their own decisions about whether that they are eligible to vote, where they should vote, and to make sure that they have the tools to make sure that their vote counts and to let us know if there are any barriers. Please, please, please spread this number far and wide. It is very helpful for us to have voters call, because when we have voters with a question that we're not answering, suggests to us that we probably have a lot more voters who have that question. And so we're integrating that into our FAQs and to a lot of our voter education materials. So please, no question is too dumb. Give us a call. We don't believe in stupid questions. Let us know. And it also helps us to know where people are seeing barriers. So for example, if a clerk's office is closed to the public and not, you know, not answering people's calls, let us know, and so that we can reach out and talk to that clerk and make sure that they have the support that they know or that they need, or reaching out to, you know, other partners and others in this community who may be able to do that. Because again, voter access and voter confidence in our elections is so, so important. All right. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. I talked for a long time. Oh, and my North Carolina just came out. Been in New Hampshire for 10 years and still. So let's turn it back over to Representative Lane for what's coming up this session.
Well, I can make that pretty short. Basically, we're going to reboot all the bills that we passed and worked on for the past 10 years, particularly those that we worked on in 2019 and 2020. So, and I guess you can go down to the other slides if you want, Kelsey. So the 4 areas that we focus on are making voting registration easier. That's what the SMART Act, which was SB 7, which Sununu just vetoed, I think last week. We also, online registration was vetoed, and we want to simplify forms. We, in the election committee, spent a lot of time trying to look at the forms and trying to simplify them. Frankly, we think that the Secretary of State has the ability to do that, but has not been willing to do so. So I will take a little bit of a segue and say, as a state representative, we elect the Secretary of State, which is a little bit unusual. And I think we need to give a lot of thought to who we want to elect, and particularly somebody who is really willing to embrace technology and to push things through that will make voting more easy for everyone, and not make it quite so complicated. Our way that we register voters and the way we do ballots is very cumbersome and can be greatly simplified, and we'll be focusing on that. We'll just bring back the redistricting commissions that we set up, and we'll probably put in the constitutional amendment again. The other area is to make voting easier, like the no excuse absentee ballot. Secretary Gardner is absolutely dead set against that. He really wants everybody to vote in person and wants it to be a very big exception for you to come in and be able to use an absentee ballot. And finally, campaign finance reform, and I won't go through all the details, but getting rid of Citizens United is probably one of the, and chip away at that, but it's all about transparency, transparency, transparency. And those will be the bills that we'll be working on. And those will be the areas that we focus on. And there were a couple questions I can answer. Should I do that, Kelsey, now? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody asked about gerrymandering, and that Sununu says that it's rare. And a lot of the Republicans say that. I think basically if you look back at the past every 10 years, you redistrict. So that's why 2020 is such an important election, because whoever wins this will control redistricting. So if the Democrats win the House, we will redistrict. If the Republicans win, they will redistrict. But every 10 years it gets done. And then what happens is the Republicans put forth and voted in districts, and the Democrats took them to court, and they won because the judges agreed that they were gerrymandered. So they go back to the legislature and they have to redo them, and they have to redo them until the judge says it's okay. So for people who say that they don't gerrymander, also the former Speaker of the House actually told people that it was designed to elect as many Republicans as possible. So I don't know why Governor Sununu thinks it's rare. It's been very common, at least in the 40 years that I've been around New Hampshire, so, and has been challenged. The other evidence that they that they don't want to embrace the redistricting commission. The Republicans look for every excuse known to man not to have a redistricting commission, and we thought they would embrace it because we thought we would win. It was going to be, we would win. A good chance that the Democrats are going to win in 2020, and they might embrace it. There were some Republicans that did, but by and large, the party line is that we don't need to do this because we don't gerrymander. Nobody gerrymanders. And so, but the fact that they won't even think about redistricting commission that's done fairly, that's done by citizens, that is not controlled by the legislature, they don't want anything to do with it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a number here that I'm pretty excited about answering. I'll try to go quickly.
Okay.
I got a direct question asking if it's legal to pass out absentee ballot applications and information on it. The applications themselves, absolutely. The RSA 594.7 states that you may distribute absentee ballot applications. However, anyone who does it who is not the Secretary of State's office or the municipality must just identify themselves and make sure they include the Secretary of State's form. So you can pass it out, but we have to use the Secretary of State's form, and we have to identify ourselves. Our COVID Vote from Home one-pager that has the organize NH on it counts as identifying ourselves. So we've been distributing it far and wide, and anyone is welcome to. Got a question about the envelope, and that the envelope doesn't give us a place to sign on the basis of concern for COVID-19. Agreed, that is confusing and uncomfortable, but you may write in COVID. You can note that for your comfort level. And then as far as any questions about people being nervous about it, about like perjury or any of that, feel confident that the Attorney General's office, who is the chief law enforcement agency here, has issued an opinion saying that any voter may vote because of COVID-19 under the disability excuse. So it does count as a disability. I know. But then the other part of it is that they've also indicated that no voter will ever be prosecuted because of noting COVID-19. So every voter can feel absolutely comfortable doing this. And from my comfort zone, I am gonna write in COVID-19 to make very clear that that is the reason, because that is my reason. An additional question was, are digital signatures acceptable? I signed mine using Adobe Acrobat. Will it get kicked back? This is also something that I am in a, let's go ahead and say, in prolonged conversation with the state about. The Secretary of State's office gave at least one clerk written guidance back in April stating that a signature that is completed with a trackpad or a mouse is absolutely acceptable. don't know if any of you all tuned into some of the extensive select committee hearings, but at the select committee hearings, the AG's and Secretary of State's office said that you absolutely could, and they endorsed the Dartmouth online tool that does that, that allows you to sign it with you know, your finger on your phone or there, so long as it's a unique signature. Should not be an issue with that. However, the Secretary of State's office has started telling clerks for some reason that it needs to be a wet signature. This is, I believe, an incorrect interpretation, and it's also contrary to what they have previously stated, both in writing and in numerous settings. So it's a little bit beyond me as to why we're arguing about this. But for me, what I did is I signed my form. I did the same. I used Adobe Acrobat, and I had my, you know, the photo of my signature that I put on there. And I emailed it to my clerk and said, is this okay? And I flagged for her I was doing it, and she said yes. You know, remember that our municipalities are the ones who run our elections. And so, yes, there should absolutely be statewide guidance. Yes, there should be tools that are made available. There are tons of nonpartisan groups that actually are ready to make live a website. I actually met with one earlier where they have our absentee ballot on the website where you may put on your signature and hit send and send it to your clerk's office. But I had to suggest to them that I didn't think it was a good idea for them to turn it live until they had confirmation at a state level or from every individual clerk's office in New Hampshire that it should be valid, because we don't want voters having their ballots rejected. Getting into the weeds, what I mean to say is if your clerk's office is fine with it, you are fine. It's up to the clerk. We'll put it there. All right, I'll pass that one back off. Connie, are there a couple you want to take?
I think I posted somebody asked for the different vetoes that I had mentioned, and I listed them in there, in the chat box. So if somebody, but in 2019, there were several related to resident versus, anyway, so about the resident battle about SB3, and there were 3 or 4 of those: HB 105, HB 106, HB 611 was no excuse absentee balloting. SB 67, sorry, would also have overturned SB 3. We had several different ways to come at SB 3, so that's why there were so many related to it. HB 706 was the Independent Redistricting Commission, and SB 151 was political contributions by LLCs, and I apologize, that's limited liability companies. I deal with that jargon too much, so I apologize. For 2020, it was HB 1672, and then I think that HB 1665 was also vetoed, and SB 7 was the so-called SMART Act, and that would be so that when you go in for a driver's license to update it, the information from DMV would come in and be shared with the central process, the central data place in the Secretary of State's office, and then disseminated to help the clerks update their records. It'd also be a good way, it would trigger the clerk to send out registration information to someone who's come in, and again, helping to use technology, helping to make the system a little bit smoother for people. The Secretary of State's office was dead set against it, and it was vetoed. So we'll be back at that. I was the sponsor of that bill, and we'll be back at that next session. So I don't know if there are other, but there are a lot of them about postage, and I don't know. Louise, do you see any questions that we haven't?
I think you did a really good job of covering the questions that were in the chat box, and also anticipating a number of the questions. I guess what I would just like to stress is that as many of you here are running for office, you will be on the front lines in terms of helping voters understand that voting absentee is a safe way to vote and the preferred way to vote this time, and to answer questions and reassure them about that, and to provide the information that they need to know so that they feel confident, our voters feel confident in the system. If there's anything that you don't know, Kelsey is fantastic at the NHDP, along with all her colleagues, calling the volunteers, call the hotline, get information. You can get back to your constituent or your voter, or you can refer them directly to the hotline. Furthermore, you're on the front lines, as we're seeing in the chat box, for the issues that are coming up. And that because things are being done a little bit differently this time around, there are lots and lots of questions, everything from how much postage do I need, to then seeing, you know, in Loudoun, oh my goodness, where you're being told if you hand deliver the ballot, you don't need to do the affidavit envelope. Those are things that we definitely need to know about to address. And so you all are the eyes and ears out there and on the front lines, and any of that information that you can get back to Kelsey and the voter protection program is going to be really essential. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Kelsey.
Sure, I did just want to note, because I can hear and I can feel your anxieties, and I understand it and I share it, and the way forward is to, you know, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst and keep on planning. So as part of this, when you're saying, you know, how do I know that my ballot will be accepted if, you know, based on assurances, the answer is that we are making sure that we are documenting those assurances. And my team is going to have lawyers on election day, both in the polls and available around the state. So if, you know, anytime they're going through absentee ballot applications or going through and pre-processing absentee ballots earlier, my team, hopefully with your help, also help us recruit. If you know any lawyers, send them our way. Our team will be there so that if we hear a note of a rejected ballot, you know, ideally we will be there and we will be able to say, I'm sorry, what are you doing? Why are you rejecting it because of this? And here is the proof saying that you should not do that. And if they don't take it, we're calling the AGs, right? This is our classic voter protection program, where we have attorneys who are at the polls to make sure that no voter who is eligible to vote is not able to. And so you all can help us at every level of that by, if we're not there, well, if they're there, if we're there, find us, make sure you find us, and calling the hotline anytime there's an issue. I love it when I get 5 calls about the same thing. I love it. It means voters are engaged. It's a real issue. And that means we get it from a lot of perspectives. And when I can call the AGs and say, I had 5 people call me because these instructions are wrong, they are confused, that, you know, lights a fire.
Right.
So let us know.
So there is one question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there is one question Bonnie Wright was asking, how an undeclared voter changes back. I think, you know, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that nothing is going to be done until after the primary and things are counted and everybody takes a deep breath. And I think at that point, call the clerk's office and they will tell you how to do that. You don't have to do it right away. You just have to do it before the next time you vote. So it's not urgent, and it certainly isn't going to affect anything in the general election. You know, you get the same ballot in the general election. It's not a party. So you have until the next primary to change it. So I guess I would just ask people to take a deep breath and just give the clerks a break. And they are going beyond the pale. And if you can volunteer, I urge you to do so.
Yeah. That's a really important point. I've often heard that the first most important thing you can do to protect democracy is to vote. The second most important thing you can do is to volunteer at the polls. And I know a lot of people are limited if you're running or, you know, by age or other concerns, but we really do need, you know, to avoid those lines at the polls and to have our polls fully staffed. Again, that's something Kelsey can help with as well. So I think that remember that in New Hampshire, we have a long and very you know, robust history of voting absentee. It's a system that has served us well. The primary thing to focus on. So if you get your ballot to the clerk and you sign that affidavit envelope, your ballot will get counted. So the problem comes with the mail system. Make sure you get it in the mail way ahead of time, or if you have any doubt, get it there in person. But once it's there, you know, you can count on this system. So part of our job is to be kind of absentee ballot voting ambassadors and try to tamp down the fear that is purposely being driven up to scare people away from using this.
Okay, we got to wrap it up because we're way over time. And thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Connie.
I was just going to tell, Rob, I just think people need to also give the message that we are not going to have same-day voting. You're not going to have same-day election results. And, you know, there are a lot of states where we've waited, times when we've waited 3, 4, 5 days, if not 2 weeks. I mean, remember Gore and Bush. So I think just remind people of that and just kind of tamper down expectations. You know, they got to hand count these things.
That's great. Kelsey's going to do this all again in half an hour. So if you guys, if you guys need a link, I think since we're going to shut this down, just email me and I'll provide you the link.
I just put it in the chat box.
Okay, it's in the chat box. Is that what you just put in?
I did, and it's on Facebook, but you do not need a Facebook account to join. So you should be able to use that and join on.
So you guys can just copy that, and I can also help you if you want. But thank you all, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
For the record, it'll be different.
There you go. There you go. There's
the
the
next
new
one.
thing that's up there.
Yeah, and to Representative Lane and to Kelsey Klementowicz, thank you. You two are just amazing champions of voting. I wanted to note too that we had Diane Schuett, Representative Schuett, on the call, and she's been a champion for redistricting reform. So thank you all for all the hard work that you're doing to make voting safe, secure, accessible, and fair for everyone. Thank you.
Tuesdays at 5:30, everybody. Thank you all. Bye-bye.